Shadow projection is one of the most fundamental and psychologically revealing concepts developed by Carl Jung. It revolves around the idea that every individual carries within themselves a shadow, a hidden part of their psyche that consists of repressed desires, instincts, weaknesses, and emotions. This shadow is not inherently evil or dangerous in itself, but it becomes a problem when it is not acknowledged or integrated into consciousness. According to Jung, when people fail to recognize and accept these darker aspects of themselves, they tend to project them outward onto others. This act of projection allows individuals to avoid dealing with uncomfortable inner truths by seeing them in the people around them instead. In everyday life, shadow projection can manifest in many subtle or overt ways. For example, someone who harbors unacknowledged feelings of jealousy may accuse others of being envious. A person with suppressed aggression might find themselves constantly labeling others as hostile or dangerous, never realizing that the emotion they fear is actually stemming from within. This process happens unconsciously, which makes it particularly insidious. The individual is usually unaware that they are projecting. Instead, they genuinely believe that the problem lies outside themselves. This conviction gives the projection emotional intensity and a sense of righteousness. The projected traits seem undeniably real in others, even if there is little to no objective basis for them. Jung emphasized that projection serves as a defense mechanism. It helps preserve the ego's fragile image of itself as good, rational, and in control. Confronting one's own shadow would mean acknowledging traits that conflict with this image, which can feel threatening. Therefore, the psyche protects itself by splitting off these unwanted parts and locating them elsewhere. The cost of this psychological maneuver is significant. It distorts relationships, causes conflict, and contributes to personal stagnation. People who are dominated by projection are often judgmental, rigid, and difficult to reason with. They tend to see the world in black and white terms, dividing others into categories of good and bad based on their own unresolved inner conflicts. Jung believed that individuals who chronically project their shadow onto others are dangerous not only to themselves, but also to those around them. They create toxic environments by accusing, blaming, and scapegoating. These behaviors can be especially harmful in close relationships or in positions of authority, where the consequences of projection are magnified. In extreme cases, entire groups or societies can become influenced by collective shadow projections. This phenomenon can be seen in instances of mass hysteria, prejudice, or political scapegoating, where a community channels its disowned fears and aggressions onto an external target. Such projections can lead to social division, discrimination, and even violence. What makes shadow projection particularly difficult to deal with is its emotional intensity. Because it is rooted in disowned parts of the self, it often triggers strong reactions. The person doing the projecting feels justified in their emotions and becomes resistant to any suggestion that the issue might lie within. This defensiveness creates a barrier to self-awareness and makes growth difficult. The more someone denies their shadow, the more power it gains over them, often erupting in uncontrolled ways. Jung described such individuals as being possessed by their projections. They are no longer acting from a place of conscious choice, but are driven by the very forces they refuse to acknowledge. One of the subtle dangers of projection is that it creates a false sense of moral superiority. The person who projects feels that they are on the side of right, battling against the wrongs they perceive in others. This self-deception allows them to feel virtuous, while avoiding the inner work necessary for genuine self-improvement. It is much easier to point out someone else's flaws than to confront one's own. But by externalizing the shadow, they lose the opportunity to grow and become more whole. Jung believed that psychological maturity requires owning and integrating the shadow, not denying it. Without this integration, the individual remains fragmented, living in a world distorted by their own unconscious content. Another aspect of shadow projection is its contagious nature. When someone projects negativity onto another person, the target of the projection may begin to internalize it, especially if they are unsure of themselves. Over time, this can lead to emotional manipulation, gaslighting, and erosion of self-esteem. In such dynamics, the projector gains power by offloading their internal chaos onto someone else, creating a distorted reality in which the other person feels responsible for the problem. These situations are emotionally draining and psychologically harmful, often resulting in lasting damage to the target's sense of self. Jung warned that it is especially important to be cautious of those who project their shadows persistently and with great conviction. These individuals often appear confident and certain of their judgments, but their clarity is rooted in avoidance rather than insight. They may surround themselves with narratives that reinforce their projections and reject any feedback that challenges them. In social or professional settings, this can lead to groupthink, where others begin to accept the projector's distorted view because it is delivered with authority. Over time, these environments become rigid, intolerant, and repressive, all driven by the unconscious need to avoid the shadow. Despite its destructive potential, projection can also serve as a clue to what is hidden within. Jung suggested that by observing the traits we most strongly react to in others, whether with hatred, fear, or contempt, we can gain insight into the parts of ourselves we have yet to accept. These reactions are often signals pointing back to our own shadow. While it takes courage to face these aspects honestly, doing so opens the path to deeper self-understanding and psychological integration. Jung did not see the shadow as something to be eliminated, but as something to be integrated into a larger, more balanced sense of self. The process of becoming whole, or what Jung called individuation, involves facing the shadow directly. This is not a one-time event, but an ongoing journey. It requires the willingness to confront uncomfortable truths, question one's motives, and take responsibility for one's emotional life. Those who avoid this inner work are more likely to live in denial, projecting their issues outward, and perpetuating cycles of blame and conflict. In contrast, those who engage with their shadow gain greater authenticity, empathy, and freedom. They become less reactive, more self-aware, and better equipped to navigate the complexities of human relationships. Jung's warning about projection is a call for radical honesty. It is an invitation to stop externalizing our pain and to turn inward with compassion and curiosity. While this path is challenging, it is also liberating. By owning the parts of ourselves we once rejected, we reclaim our wholeness and become less susceptible to the dangerous patterns that arise when the shadow is ignored. Shadow projection, when left unchecked, leads to distortion, conflict, and suffering. But when recognized and integrated, it becomes a doorway to personal transformation and genuine psychological depth. Carl Jung's understanding of the unconscious mind extended beyond the personal level into what he called the collective unconscious, a realm of shared symbols, instincts, and archetypes inherited by all humans. Archetypes, such as the hero, the victim, the mother, the trickster, and the savior, are not mere cultural stories, but powerful psychological patterns that deeply influence behavior, perception, and emotion. Jung believed that these archetypes reside in every individual, often outside of conscious awareness, subtly shaping thoughts and actions. Because they operate below the surface of rational thought, these symbols and roles carry an extraordinary emotional weight. When someone consciously or unconsciously learns to manipulate these archetypes in others, they gain the power to control, influence, and distort reality on a profound psychological level. Manipulators of the unconscious are not always overtly aggressive or visibly controlling. In fact, they often present themselves as helpers, leaders, visionaries, or caretakers. What sets them apart is their ability to tap into the unconscious patterns within others and use them to serve their own needs. They might position themselves as the savior to people who unconsciously crave rescue, or the wise authority figure to those who fear their own independence. By doing so, they gain psychological leverage. They do not have to argue logically or prove their worth. They simply embody a symbol that resonates deeply within the other person's unconscious mind. This resonance bypasses rational defenses, creating a bond that feels powerful and real, even if it is based on illusion or deception. One of the most common ways manipulation of the unconscious occurs is through the evocation of fear. Fear is a primal emotion rooted in survival, and it activates ancient, archetypal responses. A person who understands how to trigger fear, fear of abandonment, fear of failure, fear of chaos, can provoke others into a state of compliance or dependency. When fear is aroused, people tend to regress psychologically, reverting to earlier stages of emotional development. They become more suggestible, more obedient, and more likely to look for external guidance. The manipulator then steps in as the rescuer, protector, or authority, providing relief while quietly deepening their control. Another method involves the manipulation of desire. Human beings are driven by unconscious yearnings for love, recognition, security, and meaning. Someone who skillfully mirrors these desires can become almost irresistibly attractive, not because of who they are in reality, but because of what they represent to the unconscious mind. They might adopt the role of the ideal partner, the charismatic leader, or the benevolent mentor. The danger lies in the gap between the image and the reality. The manipulator constructs a persona designed to fulfill the internal archetypal scripts of others, while hiding their true intentions. The result is a psychological entanglement in which the other person becomes emotionally invested in a projection rather than in a real reciprocal relationship. Jung's concept of the persona is central to understanding this dynamic. The persona is the social mask individuals wear to interact with the world. It is not inherently deceptive. In fact, it serves a necessary function. However, when someone identifies too closely with their persona or uses it consciously to manipulate others, it becomes a tool for distortion. Manipulators of the unconscious often construct highly curated personas designed to evoke trust, admiration, or dependency. They become experts at reading what others need them to be, and then embodying that role with convincing precision. This adaptability can be mistaken for emotional intelligence, when in reality it is a tactic for control. The long-term effect of unconscious manipulation is psychological disorientation. The person being manipulated begins to lose touch with their own inner truth. They may feel confused, emotionally drained, or overly dependent without fully understanding why. Because the manipulator operates beneath the surface, the harm they cause is often invisible and difficult to articulate. Victims may blame themselves for the instability they feel, unaware that their unconscious mind is being played like an instrument. This kind of influence can persist even after the manipulator is gone, leaving behind unresolved emotional entanglements and a fractured sense of self. Jung was particularly concerned with how such dynamics could play out on a collective scale. In groups, organizations, or societies, unconscious manipulation becomes even more potent. Charismatic leaders, ideologues, and influencers can harness collective fears, desires, and archetypes to galvanize support and silence dissent. They do not need to present rational arguments if they can activate deep-seated collective emotions. By aligning themselves with archetypes like the savior, the martyr, or the avenger, they stir up unconscious energies that bypass reason and trigger automatic loyalty. History offers many examples of how such manipulation leads to mass movements, social divisions, and even atrocities. One of the distinguishing features of unconscious manipulation is that it often appears benign or even beneficial at first. The manipulator provides comfort, certainty, or inspiration. They offer solutions to complex problems and present themselves as uniquely capable of guiding others through confusion. The danger lies not in what they offer, but in what they demand in return. Uncritical trust, emotional dependence, and psychological submission. Because they operate through archetypes that feel timeless and true, questioning them can feel like a betrayal of something sacred. This internal conflict keeps victims trapped, unable to distinguish their authentic instincts from the implanted narratives they have absorbed. Jung argued that the only defense against such manipulation is increased self-awareness. When people are unaware of their own unconscious drives, they are more vulnerable to external control. Manipulators rely on others, not knowing their own inner landscape. They exploit what is hidden, not what is seen. The more someone becomes familiar with their own archetypes, fears, and desires, the harder it becomes for another person to use those elements against them. Understanding one's unconscious contents transforms them from vulnerabilities into sources of strength. It allows for more conscious choices and clearer boundaries in relationships. In relationships marked by unconscious manipulation, emotional intensity is often mistaken for depth. The connection feels powerful and meaningful, but this is frequently because it is rooted in archetypal roles rather than in mutual understanding. The manipulator may evoke feelings of destiny, cosmic alignment, or spiritual resonance, further blurring the line between illusion and authenticity. Such feelings can make it difficult for the other person to leave, even when they sense something is wrong. The unconscious bond can override logical objections, reinforcing the illusion that the relationship is fated or irreplaceable. Jung's work highlights the moral responsibility of anyone who becomes aware of how the unconscious works. With this knowledge comes the power to influence, but also the duty to use that influence ethically. Those who manipulate the unconscious for personal gain cause lasting harm by violating the psychological integrity of others. Their actions interfere with the natural process of individuation, the unfolding of the true self. Rather than encouraging growth and self-realization, they foster dependence, confusion, and regression. Manipulators of the unconscious are dangerous precisely because they do not operate through overt coercion. They invade the private, unguarded spaces of the psyche and rearrange the contents to serve their own agenda. Their power lies in subtlety, in emotional resonance, and in symbolic suggestion. By casting themselves in archetypal roles, they create illusions that feel more real than reality. Their influence bypasses the rational mind and settles deep into the emotional core, where it can quietly shape beliefs, behaviors, and identities. Jung's insight into this phenomenon remains a profound warning about the hidden dynamics that govern human interaction, and the need for vigilance not only against external manipulation but also against the inner blindness that makes it possible. Carl Jung's understanding of emotional possession stems from his broader view of the psyche as being composed of conscious and unconscious elements that are often in dynamic tension. He did not see emotions simply as fleeting states, but as powerful psychic forces that, when unchecked or unintegrated, can take on a life of their own. According to Jung, when a person is overwhelmed by a particular emotion such as envy, rage, or pride, they may become possessed by it. In this context, possession means that the individual no longer acts from a place of conscious awareness or personal agency, but is instead driven by the emotion as though it were an autonomous entity. The ego, which normally maintains a sense of identity and rational control, is pushed aside, and the emotion becomes the dominant voice within the psyche. This kind of possession results in behavior that is often extreme, irrational, or disproportionate to the situation. The possessed person cannot see beyond the emotional state they are in. Their perception, thoughts, and actions become distorted to fit the narrative that the emotion creates. Someone possessed by envy, for example, may interpret even benign actions from others as threats or insults, constantly comparing themselves and harboring resentment. Rage can produce sudden outbursts, a sense of entitlement to harm, or a refusal to see the humanity in others. Pride, when inflated to pathological levels, can manifest as arrogance, disdain, or an inability to admit error. These emotions are not simply passing moods, but controlling psychic complexes that act through the individual rather than with them. Jung viewed these emotions not as mere reactions, but as archetypal energies that come from the deeper layers of the unconscious. When the ego is weak or underdeveloped, it is more susceptible to being overtaken by these forces. The emotional possession acts like a temporary identity. The person becomes the anger, the jealousy, or the superiority, rather than experiencing it as a part of their emotional landscape. In this state, they lose their capacity for reflection and self-regulation. The emotion colors all aspects of their interaction with others, creating conflict, miscommunication, and alienation. In relationships, emotionally possessed individuals often bring chaos and unpredictability because they are ruled by unacknowledged and overwhelming emotions. Their reactions can be out of proportion or inappropriate to the context. A minor slight may trigger a storm of rage. A compliment to someone else might provoke deep-seated jealousy. Any challenge to their inflated pride might be met with defensiveness or passive-aggressive behavior. Over time, these patterns erode trust and intimacy. Partners, friends, or colleagues begin to walk on eggshells, unsure of what will set the person off. The emotionally possessed individual often lacks insight into their own behavior. They believe their reactions are justified and see the problem as lying entirely outside themselves. Jung noted that these emotional possessions can often be traced to unresolved conflicts or traumas in the unconscious. When a person has not integrated certain aspects of their shadow, the hidden rejected parts of the self, those disowned elements can emerge in emotionally charged forms. The more the person represses these contents, the more power they gain in the unconscious, and the more likely they are to erupt in uncontrollable ways. Emotional possession is thus not merely a personality flaw, but a sign of psychic imbalance. It reflects the tension between the conscious ego and the deeper layers of the psyche, where powerful forces lie waiting to be acknowledged and understood. One of the characteristics of emotional possession is its tendency to repeat itself in patterns. The possessed individual often finds themselves in recurring situations that provoke the same emotional responses. This repetition is not accidental, but is a form of psychic compensation. The unconscious keeps presenting similar scenarios in an attempt to bring awareness to the unresolved issue. Until the individual becomes conscious of the root cause of their emotional turmoil, they remain caught in these loops. They may change partners, jobs, or social circles, but the same emotional dramas will re-emerge in slightly different forms. Jung also observed that emotional possession can be contagious. When someone is possessed by a strong emotion, they can evoke similar states in others. Rage can trigger fear or defensive anger in those around them. Envy can provoke competitiveness. Pride can awaken feelings of inferiority or resentment. This emotional contagion creates toxic environments, where clear communication and mutual respect become difficult. The emotional atmosphere becomes charged and unstable, making it hard for people to maintain their own psychological balance. Those who spend time with emotionally possessed individuals may find themselves feeling drained, confused, or constantly on edge. From a psychological perspective, emotional possession can be understood as the activation of a cluster of thoughts, memories, and feelings centered around a specific theme. Jung defined a complex as a splinter personality, meaning it has a semi-autonomous existence within the psyche. When a complex is triggered, it can take over the person's behavior temporarily. The individual becomes a vessel for the emotion and its associated story. This is why people often say or do things in the heat of emotion that they later regret. They were, in Jung's terms, not fully themselves in that moment, but were speaking and acting from a part of the psyche that had taken control. Jung emphasized that awareness is the first step in addressing emotional possession. Without awareness, the individual continues to be governed by forces they do not understand. They externalize the cause of their suffering, blaming others, the situation, or bad luck. This externalization prevents them from taking responsibility for their inner life and perpetuates the cycle of possession. Over time, the repeated surrender to these emotional states can solidify into character traits, leading others to label the person as angry, bitter, arrogant, or unstable. But beneath these labels is often an unresolved inner conflict that has never been brought into the light of consciousness. The social consequences of emotional possession are profound. In workplaces, it can lead to breakdowns in communication, power struggles, or toxic leadership. In families, it can create lasting wounds, especially when children grow up with caregivers who are emotionally volatile or controlling. In communities, it can foster division and hostility when collective emotions are stirred up and not processed thoughtfully. The inability to recognize and contain emotional possession contributes to much of the interpersonal and societal conflict that Jung believed was rooted in the failure to engage in genuine self-reflection. Jung did not see emotions themselves as the enemy. Emotions are natural and essential parts of the human experience. They provide information, energy, and motivation. But when emotions are not recognized, understood, or integrated, they can become destructive. Emotional possession is a sign that the individual has lost touch with their center, with the stable part of the psyche that can hold emotion without being overwhelmed by it. Restoring that balance requires a confrontation with the inner world, a willingness to explore the sources of one's emotional patterns, the childhood experiences or unmet needs that lie behind them, and the beliefs that keep them alive. Jung saw emotional possession as a spiritual and psychological crisis. It signals the need for transformation, not suppression. The emotions that possess an individual are not random. They are messengers from the unconscious, pointing toward what needs to be healed or integrated. Ignoring them only increases their power. Facing them, however painful, opens the path to greater wholeness. When the ego can withstand the force of emotion without collapsing into it, the individual gains not only emotional freedom, but also a deeper understanding of themselves and their place in the human experience. Emotional possession, in Jung's view, is a profound expression of the soul's struggle for balance, meaning and self-realization. Carl Jung introduced the concept of the persona as the social mask individuals wear to navigate the expectations of society. It is the face one presents to the world, shaped by roles, norms, duties, and the desire for acceptance or success. While the persona is necessary for functioning in a social world, it allows for communication, cooperation, and the formation of identity within a group. Jung warned that over-identification with it can lead to psychological imbalance. When someone becomes too closely identified with their persona, they begin to suppress or deny their inner reality. This creates a split between the external image and the internal self, resulting in a hollow existence characterized by falseness and emotional exhaustion. The inauthentic persona is not simply a polite or professional demeanor. It is a false self constructed and maintained at the expense of authenticity. The individual wears a mask, not as a temporary adaptation, but as a permanent identity. They become the role they play, whether that role is the successful executive, the nurturing parent, the spiritual teacher, the loyal partner, or any other socially rewarded image. Their behavior, speech, and even emotional responses are dictated by what they believe is expected of them, not by what they actually feel or think. Over time, this leads to a sense of disconnection from one's own soul. Jung believed that the danger of the inauthentic persona lies in its ability to prevent individuation, the process by which a person becomes who they truly are, integrating both conscious and unconscious aspects of the self. The persona is meant to be a bridge between the individual and the outer world, but when it becomes a wall, it obstructs inner development. The person who is trapped in their persona avoids introspection and remains blind to the contents of the unconscious. They fear that letting go of their mask will lead to rejection, vulnerability, or collapse. As a result, they cling to the persona with increasing rigidity, even when it no longer serves them. Such individuals often appear controlled, agreeable, or polished, but this surface hides a deep-seated anxiety. Because their persona is not rooted in their authentic self, it must be constantly maintained and defended. Any situation that threatens to expose the gap between the mask and the true self triggers discomfort or panic. These people may avoid intimacy, difficult conversations, or unpredictable environments because they cannot allow the mask to slip. This fear of exposure creates emotional distance and superficial relationships. Others may sense that something is off, that there is a lack of depth or sincerity, even if they cannot articulate why. The suppression of the true self also gives rise to inner conflict. Desires, emotions, and thoughts that do not fit the persona are repressed and pushed into the unconscious. But the unconscious does not remain silent. What is repressed gains energy and eventually surfaces in distorted or disruptive forms. This might manifest as depression, anxiety, compulsive behavior, or sudden emotional outbursts. The more the individual tries to maintain control through the persona, the more pressure builds beneath the surface. They may feel increasingly alienated, both from others and from themselves, unable to find meaning or fulfillment despite outward success. The inauthentic persona can be particularly draining to others. Because the person is not emotionally honest, they create a relational environment based on performance rather than connection. Interactions become transactional or manipulative, guided by what the persona wants to achieve rather than by mutual understanding. People who engage with such individuals often feel unheard, unseen, or subtly manipulated. There is no genuine exchange, only a performance that demands constant affirmation. This dynamic can be exhausting, especially for those who are emotionally attuned and seek authentic connection. Jung saw spiritual danger in this kind of falseness, because it blocks the path to the deeper self. The persona becomes a false god, a substitute for the soul. Instead of seeking truth, growth, or wholeness, the person seeks approval, status, or control. This spiritual stagnation results in a life that may be outwardly orderly but inwardly dead. The individual loses touch with the symbolic, archetypal, and imaginative dimensions of life. Dreams, intuitions, and creative impulses are ignored or dismissed, further deepening the disconnection from the unconscious. The inner world becomes a wasteland, populated only by the echoes of suppressed truths. Jung warned that when a person becomes overly identified with the persona, they become vulnerable to collapse. Life eventually presents challenges that the persona cannot handle. Loss, illness, failure, betrayal. In such moments, the mask cracks, and the person is confronted with their inner emptiness. If they have spent years denying their true self, they may not have the psychological tools to cope. The collapse of the persona can then lead to a crisis of identity, where the person no longer knows who they are outside of the role they once played. This crisis, though painful, can also be an opportunity for transformation, forcing the person to begin the journey inward. The inauthentic persona also contributes to collective illusions. In social and professional settings, groups often reward persona-based behavior, encouraging conformity and discouraging dissent. Entire cultures can become dominated by surface values, where appearances matter more than substance. People become actors in a shared fiction, each reinforcing the other's mask. Authenticity becomes a threat to the system, and those who dare to speak or act from the soul are marginalized or dismissed. Jung saw this dynamic at work in institutions, ideologies, and mass movements, where individuality is sacrificed for the sake of unity or image. What makes the inauthentic persona spiritually dangerous is not just its falseness, but its seductive nature. It offers comfort, recognition, and a sense of control. It promises safety from rejection and a clear role to play. But this comfort comes at the cost of aliveness. The person who lives only through the persona becomes a ghost in their own life, cut off from the depths of feeling, thought, and purpose. Their relationships lack vitality, their work lacks soul, and their sense of self becomes brittle and dependent on external validation. Jung emphasized the need for conscious confrontation with the persona. This does not mean discarding it entirely. Social roles and responsibilities are real, but rather recognizing it as a mask, not the face. The healthy ego knows the difference between the role it plays and the self it contains. It can use the persona flexibly without being ruled by it. But the inauthentic persona is rigid and defensive, unable to adapt without anxiety. Its power lies in the fear of what lies beneath, in the unconscious truths the person has been avoiding. The path to wholeness for Jung requires the integration of the shadow and the discovery of the true self behind the persona. This is not a one-time event, but an ongoing process of self-inquiry, emotional honesty, and symbolic engagement with the unconscious. Only by facing what has been hidden can the person begin to dissolve the false self and recover the vitality of the soul. The inauthentic persona, then, is not just a psychological obstacle, but a spiritual exile from truth, from meaning, and from one's own deepest reality. It is a warning sign that the life being lived is not the life that seeks to be lived from within.